Here, Matt, is there any kind of intro you want to do before we kick things off?
Nope, I'll let you just take it and run with it.
Sounds great. That's dangerous last words. But yeah, so hi everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Matt, can you see the first slide? Everything look good?
Yep, looks good.
Cool, thank you. So yeah, morning everyone. My name is Hardy Kern. I'm Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy. Specifically, I manage our pesticides and birds campaign. And it is a weird job. I spent about 9 years in professional animal care, got a hankering for policy and sort of the mushier sides of bird conservation and wanted to move into a different space. And now I am a work from home bird lobbyist, which is kind of a made up job, but one that I'm very happy to have. And I live in Columbus, Ohio. I love going birding around there. Our state has some really, really amazing forests. And you have a fantastic co-presenter today because working on bird conservation in the state of Ohio, there are two questions that everybody gets asked. Number one, have you ever been to McGee Marsh? And number two, oh my God, do you know Matt Shumar? And those two questions are the magic passwords to bird conservation in the state. So really, really glad to be here. Just a quick little bit about our organization, in case you haven't heard of us. American Bird Conservancy is dedicated to conserving birds and their habitats across the Americas. And on the right is our pyramid that we use to sort of tier our work and figure out exactly how we like to address different threats to birds. And what I really like working about, what I really like about working at American Bird Conservancy is essentially if there's something to do with bird conservation, we probably have at least one person working on it. And if not, we're in the process of hiring somebody to work on it. So we have field biologists. We're about 80% field biologists working across the country on a lot of privately owned forests, privately managed forests, a lot of working lands for wildlife programs, either grasslands, farms, you name it, all sorts of different programs that we're lucky enough to work with landowners on. We have folks in Hawaii and in Latin America that are doing overwintering habitat conservation for a lot of bird species, or focusing on birds like the native Hawaiian honey creepers that are critically endangered. And then down in this yellow section here towards the bottom, the bigger foundation of our pyramid is where my role falls, which is threats to all birds. You know, just a nice catch-all there that we can have at the bottom. And in this space, we have my position, which focuses on environmental toxicants and how they might affect bird populations. We have people that work on window collisions and renewable energy and marine pollution from a policy standpoint. So not only are we an organization that has conservationists on the ground doing surveys, restoring habitat, we also have folks working at all levels of government, municipal, county, state, federal, to do all kinds of fun stuff. And what makes bird conservation, especially as a policy area, so difficult and so exciting is this map right here that you're looking at. When it comes to federal approaches to policy and even state approaches to policy and conservation and the Endangered Species Act in a lot of cases, we like species that stay relatively in one area. We like knowing, okay, they're threatened by this thing in this area, so we're going to set up a conservation reserve here. We're going to get rid of the practices here, or we're going to require that you don't do this thing at this time of year because we know that ipso facto, it directly will impact bird populations, or in endangered species rather. But for birds, this is the amount of movement that we see throughout the year. They're not just hanging out in one area. I recently went to a fabulous presentation that Matt did where he really highlighted the fact that, you know, we have this antiquated idea that birds will be in their wintering habitats, they book it north, they breed, they book it back south. So it's sort of a, you know, condo in Florida, house in Ohio type of situation. But in reality, they're almost always on the move. And if they rest, it's not for very long in those overwintering areas. They spend a lot of time moving through the forest land, our backyards, our parkland that we have. And because of their moving around nature, it can be a little bit difficult to conserve some species unless they have a very small defined breeding area. If anyone here is familiar with the Kirtland's warbler, they need a very specific type of forest system in a very specific area of Michigan and Canada. If it's another species like the blue-winged warbler that I have over my shoulder here, or other birds that are highly migratory like red knots, which go up and down the coast, these beautiful shorebirds, or out west, there's the marbled murrelet, which nests in old growth forests, that can be a little bit more difficult. And that's why I'm so lucky that I get the opportunity to do programs like these and webinars and talk to folks about how conservation is sort of an all over the place endeavor. And especially for birds, this is important right now because outside of the endangered species, and there's about 99 listed species of birds that fall under the Federal Endangered Species Act in North America. We're in the middle of a pretty massive bird decline right now. Since 1970, we have lost about 3 billion with a B, birds. And I'm not saying that this is, the losses that we experience cyclically throughout the year. Some die during migration or, of old age, and then we have more born in the spring. This is basically 3 billion birds below the baseline. And what this looks like in practice is about 1 in 4 birds gone from feeders and backyards and habitats since 1970. And the bird species that were really particularly impacted are grassland birds, so about a 53% decline. But the ones that we want to focus on today with the work that you all do are aerial insectivores. So these are species like swifts and swallows and martins and flycatchers, things that are flying around catching bugs out of the air, things that might rely on much higher up habitats like forested ecosystems. And before I start getting into the nitty-gritty about pesticides and complicated names and all kinds of stuff, I just want to give a quick disclaimer that American Bird Conservancy is not anti-pesticide. We are not anti-active management. We are not anti-conservation practices that might require some intervention. We actively do all of those. We support those. And we're lucky enough to work with a lot of forest managers and landowners to make working lands useful for wildlife or set up easements or reserves or whatever it might be that work as effectively as possible for birds. So you're going to hear a lot of not fun stuff about pesticides moving forward here, but I have to tell you, this is not our way of saying we should stop using all chemicals. We just support a thoughtful and measured approach to it. And I'm sure there will be a lot of time in the Q&A to go further into that. So one question that we're experiencing a lot is there a link in insect declines and insectivorous birds? Because we know that there's a bird decline. If you've watched the news for the last 10 years, there's a lot of people talking about an insect decline. And a big question that's been brought up is, are the two even related? And Doug Tallamy, the master gardener, and Greg Schreiber, who has been a fantastic researcher, got together. They looked at this 2 billion fewer birds data that was published, or the paper rather was published in 2019. And what they decided to do was look at what type of birds were really in decline and which ones in that survey data were doing okay. And they found every scientist's dream, which is data without a lot of noise in it. Essentially, the birds that really depended on bugs were the ones that we were seeing massive declines in. About 304 species that were insect dependent. So this might be something like a swallow or a swift that's really mostly eating bugs, or even something like a robin or a hummingbird or a cardinal, where they are seasonally dependent on insects, usually when they're feeding their young. And then bird species that were not experiencing a population level decline or as big a decline were species that were primarily carnivorous or fish eating, or something like waterfowl, where they're eating a lot of grass or small invertebrates in the water. And so it was a really interesting, really even, or not even, but a very clear-cut split. And we're looking at this as a pretty good indicator that we know insect health is really important to birds. In fact, their analysis has found that about 96% of terrestrial birds depend on insects at some point in their life, whether that's feeding them like this water thrush to their babies, or like I said, with the aerial insectivores, kind of constantly feeding on them throughout the year. So quick question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat or just think it to yourself. How many caterpillars do you think a single Carolina chickadee will feed its nestlings before they fledge? So we're talking about one teeny tiny chickadee. Nestlings can be anywhere from about 1 to 12 birds, depending on the size of the brood at that point. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars for their nestlings before they fledge. And that's just one, group of chicks for a single year moving forward. And as they've looked into what the impacts of this really look like on birds, they're finding that when there are fewer insects to feed their babies, there's smaller clutches, so there's less, they're reproducing less in general, more frequent nestling mortality, specifically from starvation, fewer fledgling offspring, and lower body mass of the fledglings that do survive. This is just our way of further illustrating that there's a really close tie between insect populations and bird populations. Now, I'm talking a lot about pesticides, and I want to be clear about what I mean when I'm referring to pesticides. The way that the federal government defines a pesticide is any product that repels, reduces, or kills a pest organism. This means that technically a citronella candle could be considered a pesticide. This means that things like bug spray, such as Raid that I've got pictured here, can be considered to be a pesticide as well. So we have, things that you might spray outside and directly apply. There are pesticides that are used on our lawns and our gardens and our parklands. And then, of course, there's pesticides that we use primarily in agriculture as well. And when we talk about pesticides, it gets a little bit confusing when we get into some of the technical names. And so I have this slide pulled up. I'm sure many of you, especially people that work directly in forest management, land management, are familiar with pesticide labeling. But for folks who, just buy them at the store or spray them on our yards or whatever, it can be a little bit confusing. Pesticides, like everything else, have a trade name. So in this case, it might be Roundup, or in this fictional label, Rondo herbicide. And that's the product name. That's what they can market it as. But within that product, there are a bunch of different things that all work together to make it the chemical that it is. You have your active ingredient, or AI. And this is the product that's doing all the heavy lifting. This is the chemical that is preventing the broadleaf weed emergence, or this is the chemical that is getting in and actually disrupting the endocrine system of the emerald ash borer or whatever it is. Then you have your other ingredients, and this can be anything else that they put in the chemical. This can be water that they just need to, make it more liquid. This could be additives that they put in there to help with spreading out or not spreading out if they need to, adherence so that the product might stick to something, you name it. And all of those, it's typically the much larger portion of the pesticide. They do not have to be disclosed on the label because they are seen to be trade secrets. This is the way that they keep companies from just directly copying each other. So when we're talking about a pesticide, and as you hear me talk about active ingredients later on, if you want to find out what we're talking about or what active ingredients you might have around you, this is how you can read the label. Just look right on the front. They have to disclose it in the amount of percentages. The name of the active ingredient is usually something incomprehensible like 2,4-D or glufosinate or cyantroniloprol or something like that, glyphosate in this case. The other ingredients are all of the additives that help the chemical do what it needs to do. And of course, it has to total up to 100% of that particular item. So all pesticides in the United States are registered under a single piece of legislation that's called FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It was originally passed in 1947. And what I think is important to kind of remember about this is when FIFRA was first put into law, the Environmental Protection Agency didn't exist. This was primarily so that there was a standard by which pesticide labels were created. It says how often the EPA has to review them, which is every 15 years. But when it was originally thought of, it existed under the Department of Agriculture. So it was being regulated by the agricultural industry, basically, and their goal was primarily to register more products and make sure that growers had the tools that they needed. After the EPA was created in the early 70s, the Environmental Protection Agency took over management of FIFRA and pesticides and registrations, and they have kind of kept the hold over it since. But because of that fundamental switch from producers and producer policy folks being the ones to manage pesticides going to an agency whose onus is environmental protection, it made for kind of a weird transition. And what makes FIFRA different from a lot of other environmental laws or laws aimed at protecting the environment is, unlike the Endangered Species Act, unlike the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, all of which have a mandate that says, you need to protect this resource kind of at all costs, or, it's sort of a legal backstop to everything. It says you must do this. FIFRA actually is a cost benefit analysis. So when a chemical is first proposed, whether it's a new product such as Roundup or a new active ingredient like glyphosate, the herbicide, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, what EPA has to do is look at a bunch of testing data, figure out how the product works, figure out what species it might impact and how they can do something about that, and then weigh all of that against the benefits that are brought about by that individual chemical. So rather than saying there's something new that's been proposed and it's really bad for birds or it's really bad for salamanders or what have you, therefore we can't use it, they say, okay, it's bad for birds, it's bad for salamanders, but it's really good for controlling this invasive species, or it's really good on soybeans, or it's really good on oak trees or whatever it might be. And then they have to weigh back and forth quite literally how impactful and how necessary a product is versus the potential risks of using it. Now, when we're talking about pesticide exposure to birds specifically, there's three main ways that they might come across it. One is directly ingesting it, either from a seed that's coated in it or an insect that's recently been coated in it during a spraying event. They might accidentally get it on feathers or skin or inhale it. And then with some chemicals, such as systemic insecticides that actually incorporate into plant tissues, they might come across chemicals as they're feeding on nectar or pollen or fruit products that a plant is producing. And our best estimates that we have actually came from a USDA Forest Service study that was commissioned in 2005. About 67 million birds are lost to pesticide exposure every year. And this is direct exposure. So this is not the, food sources or habitat things. This is birds that are directly ingesting it or being exposed to it. And this is from a lot of different things, right? This is from agricultural uses, from spraying, soil drenching, all sorts of different stuff, as well as how we use it in our backyards. Almost all of this is unintentional and accidental take. There are also ecosystem impacts. You can see, impacts on insects that the birds are trying to eat or invertebrates. It can get into waterways depending on what's being used. And then it can also start to crop up, no pun intended, in our agricultural systems when you have different amounts of resistance that are established or changing the way that we use it on agriculture as well. And just for an interesting look a little bit deeper into how pesticide impacts can start to impact the ecosystem that birds live in. This is in the Netherlands, a study done in 2014. They were trying to examine why there was a huge decline in corn buntings, which are tiny little sparrow-like species that primarily lives in farmlands. And they were noticing that there were fewer and fewer birds every year. And so Caspar Hallman went and looked at it, and he looked at the areas where the birds were declining. He looked at all the different factors he could think of that could potentially correlate, everything from how much urban area was in a particular farmland, how much natural area, what was the nitrogen rate like in the soil, how big an area was planted, were there greenhouses, and the number one thing, really the only significant correlate that he had, as you can see on the right here, was the use of imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid insecticide, or an insecticide that works by interrupting an insect's nervous system and kind of causing them to go on the fritz a little bit. So they looked at birds in the area as well and found that the birds themselves were not being exposed, but rather there was a precipitous decline in the insects in the area. And they think that they were seeing fewer birds because there were fewer insects around, possibly due to this insecticide use. And this is just, a graph I'm sure y'all have seen before, a picture y'all have seen before, similar things before, about how overuse of pesticides, particularly in some agricultural systems, can sort of keep going through the water cycle, especially if it's something that is particularly mobile in water. There are other ways that pesticides might be used that we don't really think about always. This is less so an issue in forest management and more so in large monoculture crops or specialty crop growth. But there's a lot of products that are used as seed coatings as well. So if you go to the store, you go to the co-op and you're buying your corn seed for the year, or you are buying your sorghum or wheat or milo or millet or what have you. This is even the case in some head-started tree species as well. They might have a coating on the outside that is made up of chemicals, and they look like these on the left. I call them danger skittles. The tricky thing with seed coatings is that due to a loophole in FIFRA, that federal law, these are not technically considered to be a use of pesticides in the United States. So they fall through a pretty big loophole. And the graph on the right is just illustrating how when these products were originally brought onto the market, the idea was that neonicotinoids as seed treatments would replace a lot of the overtop uses of these chemicals. We'd have to spray them less. We'd have to spray fewer insecticides generally because we had these seed treatments. We have these new highly toxic and small amount chemicals. The graph on the top shows neonicotinoid adoption. The graph on the bottom shows a lot of other chemical usage. And you can see even as neonic usage goes up, we don't really see a significant decline in other chemical usage. So there's a lot of different ways that these pesticides might be entering our system. Neonic specifically can really heavily impact a lot of bird species. A single seed coated with a neonic has enough active ingredient on it to be toxic to a songbird. And there's also enough in there to be toxic to 80,000 bees. It's very highly water soluble, so it travels through ecosystems. It travels through plant tissue pretty easily as well. And all of this has recently come to a head. So especially if you've been talking to your extension agents recently, if you have them, or if you're an extensionist yourself, as some folks on the call are, Kathy is, you might have been hearing a lot more recently about the EPA introducing lots of new chemical restrictions and chemical strategies. And the reason for this is because environmental groups have taken the EPA to court because they feel like a lot of the use of chemicals has not been in compliance with federal law. For instance, there was a chemical called sulfoxaflor that's used pretty extensively in the treatment for insects on smaller herbaceous crops. It's also used pretty commonly in ornamental productions. And the EPA brought a new use of sulfoxaflor onto the market without going through the necessary machinery of approvals and research guidelines. So Earth Justice brought the chemical company to court, and this is what the judge said afterwards, which is pretty spicy stuff. When an agency deliberately ignores Congress's legislative command, it undermines the will of the people and ultimately our constitutional structure of government. That's pretty intense language over a chemical not going through Endangered Species Act process. But what it's led to is a lot of different chemicals, so I'm getting ahead of myself, that are now coming under additional scrutiny and review by the EPA for how they might impact endangered species and those 98 endangered species of birds that live in the United States. And one thing that we do as American Bird Conservancy, every time we're commenting on a new chemical registration, every time there's a court case that comes out, is we really like to look at how those chemicals are being used. And we always push for an exemption for the use of them in conservation practices and to combat novel invasive species. So just want to toss that out there as well. And with some chemicals and the way that they're tested in laboratories before they're registered, it gets a little bit difficult to get a full idea of how they might impact wildlife and the environment. So up on top here, there's a map of how an insecticide is tested in the laboratory on a bunch of different bird species. And these are all very common species used in lab tests that the chemical companies will perform themselves and then submit the data to the Environmental Protection Agency. And as you can imagine, as the body size of a bird gets larger, which is going left to right here, you can see the names of all the bird species. The amount of active ingredient it takes to have a significant effect on them goes up. Heavier bodied birds, larger birds require more chemicals to climb up and show an impact. Makes total sense. What isn't really well accounted for is what's shown in the bottom. This is a logarithmic graph taken from the same amount of data. And what we find is that as the body size of a bird decreases, the impact of the same amount of chemical goes up exponentially. So it's not a one-to-one ratio of just as you get bigger, it takes more chemical. We actually see that as your body gets smaller, the impacts from a chemical are much more significant. And this isn't something that's really well accounted for when the Environmental Protection Agency is putting out advisements on how to use these chemicals safely. There's also good evidence that shows that some specific types of bird prey sources might be impacted by different chemicals. So imidacloprid is highly chronically toxic to mayfly nymphs, but on something like a fruit fly or a daphnia, which is used in laboratory testing, they are not shown to be very, very toxic. So in a lab setting, these chemicals don't show a high chronic toxicity load, but in the field, we see something very different. And in general, fewer bugs means less food for birds. So when there's less bugs around, like I said, 96% of bugs, or birds rather, rely on bugs at some point in their life. They might turn to less than optimal diets, such as going into our agricultural sectors a lot more, or feeding on seed. They have to increase their foraging distance. They have to just travel further away from their nests, travel further away from their ranges in order to find enough food. And this can lead to increased predation by both introduced species and by native species. So everything from Cooper's hawks to outside ranging cats. And don't worry, I'm not going to make today about outdoor cats. That's a separate conversation we can have at some point, though. But what I'm really excited about, that's the end of the depressing part, I promise. What I'm excited about in the work that I'm lucky enough to get to do is that there are so many ways that this problem is being addressed really creatively. And I work with a lot of groups that are very, very heavily in favor of no chemicals being used, or we want everything to go to organic, or, you know, forests should just be completely left alone and sort of allow nature to take them back. And we take a very different approach, which is why I like working at American Bird Conservancy. There's a lot of ways that practices can be altered or incorporated well to support both economic gains and economic needs, as well as conservation needs. And one of my favorite papers to reference was this study carried out in 2018, which essentially looked at different types of small patches of biodiversity, different types of small ecosystems surrounded by other types of land. And what they found unequivocally was that small habitats, small areas, relatively speaking, of course, managed well and with high biodiversity can have a really big impact on conservation. They looked at areas that were surrounded by cities or farm fields or monocultures, and the smaller areas that had high degrees of biodiversity were actually more important and more heavily used and more productive for native wildlife than an area that was larger and had a bit of biodiversity and wasn't surrounded by these highly productive areas. And what I'm trying to say here is it doesn't have to be an either or. It's not a, you know, we either have to focus on production or we have to focus on conservation, and there's no middle ground. You can very much do both. And these graphs do a really great job of showing that. This is from an analysis in Australia on the top, and then the United States in the bottom, where they looked at species habitat suitability and prevalence of different species that we might be familiar with. And basically, they found that the areas that were small but highly biodiverse, surrounded by areas that were more heavily managed, were a lot more important than areas that were larger and had less management when it came to the productive areas. And I'm happy to go into this a little bit more later too. And the biggest thing that I'd like to advocate for is something a lot of you, if not all of you, are probably very familiar with, and that is integrated pest management. And when I say IPM, I mean true integrated pest management. There's a lot of cases where I feel chemical rotation has sort of taken the place of integrated pest management, but it's a wonderful way of thinking through things. It was proposed back in the 60s originally, before chemical use in forest land and agriculture land got to be what it is now. And it just says that, chemical use should be considered, but it should be minimized and used in as highly targeted a manner as possible. And that there's lots of other practices that we can use to build up on that. This is something, we don't have to go through all of these, but just in general, when it comes to pesticide use, these are ways that I like to encourage people to start thinking about the way that they're using chemicals to manage their land, whether they're synthetic or otherwise. And that is just one, assess your current practices. There's a lot of legacy practices that carry over between growing years, between owners, between managers. And it's just sort of well, we've always done it that way. Number two is, as much as you can, get off of a set schedule. I'm not saying, oh, it's spring and therefore we need to start treating for whatever, particularly leaf or bark pest or whatever it is. But if you have a consultant come out from a chemical company or pest management company, and they say, you really need to spray for mosquitoes here every 2 months, like clockwork. Sometimes you need to, sometimes you don't. If you are on a schedule because someone told you to be, and they haven't explained to you why you need to be on that schedule, that's a great way to examine how you could start reducing chemical load. Exploring alternatives, developing an IPM plan, of course, plant native, which Matt's going to talk about more in a minute. If you're a facility or a private land that hosts visitors or invites birders or anybody else onto your property, this is a great way to start telling them about the practices that you implement. If you're able to get involved politically and so interested, letting elected officials know what you're about, the types of practices that you would like to see incentivized, is something that you can do. I'm a policy wonk, so that's something that I value a lot. And this is a farm bill year right now. And actually, Senator Debbie Stabenow just released the Democrats' overarching view of the farm bill for this upcoming year. And there's some great forestry incentive programs in there. The House version of the bill, the Republican version of the bill, has the forest conservation easement program loaded in there. I was just helping with a press release on that before we got on this morning. So there's a lot of great things that can be done through policy, because luckily forests are actually one of the things where people agree on quite a bit. And then this is just a great graphic from the National Wildlife Federation about how, if small areas, your lawns, whatever woodlot you may have access to, managed with native practices and native plants, can be a lot more productive than something more traditional like a large lawn monoculture. And if you're interested more in neonicotinoids, we've got some great stuff on our website that I'm happy to talk about. But furthermore, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Matt to talk more about what you can do at home.
All right, thanks, Hardy. Yeah, let me share my screen. All right, are you seeing that on your end?
Yes, we are.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thank you so much, Hardy. You always do a really great job of synthesizing what most of you can probably tell is a very broad and very complex subject. We really only touched on a couple different classes of pesticides, but we could really have a whole webinar series diving into this and talking about various aspects. So Hardy, in a great transition there, kind of started talking about ways in which we think about approaching the management and minimization of chemical uses. And I'm sure all of you are probably thinking, what can you do to really help with this? And so what I'd like to do here as we wrap up is talk about some of those approaches and then reinforce some of the details that Hardy provided to talk about why some of these things are so important for some bigger picture concepts. And so if we think about the things that we can do, we can sort of divide that into a couple big subject areas. And so one is thinking about this as a top-down approach, and Hardy alluded to that a little bit when he's talking about getting involved in politically and with legislation. And this is usually the one that sort of people go to first. When we talk about these complex environmental issues, usually the knee-jerk response is, well, what are they doing about it? Why aren't they doing something about this? Well, we need to think about who the they are in this. And so this is one approach, or something that you all should be doing as part of your toolbox, and that is to support elected officials and legislation dealing with the control and responsible use of pesticides. And so I'll echo what Hardy had mentioned earlier, in that we're not talking or suggesting about a ban on chemicals. I unfortunately, for better or worse, I need to use them in some of the habitat management work that I do in controlling invasive species that are really problematic. It's just a matter of how they're used and controlled, and being really smart about that. So supporting elected officials and supporting organizations who are really working in this, like the American Bird Conservancy, is really important. However, I think something that we all should be doing when we think about any conservation issue is looking at this as a bottom-up approach too, and really looking inside, or looking in the mirror, and thinking about this in terms of what we all do as individuals on the landscape. And so the approach there is really thinking about making informed consumer choices and managing your own patch. And so the informed consumer choices is a big one. We live in the good old US of A, where capitalism drives everything, and really consumer choices, the market drives everything. And so we really have a lot of power in suggesting the ways that we go on these really important topics through our consumer choices. And so thinking about if this is something that is ingrained in our food supply, in our landscape, thinking about the things that you buy too. Now, this is complex as well, and it's not clear cut. There are also social and economic barriers behind some of this, and not everybody can make the choice to buy local and buy organic as much as possible. But I will say, if you are in a financial position that you can do those things, that is a really powerful tool, and we have a lot of power as individual consumers. And we'll talk a little bit more about managing your own patch as well, and what that means. A lot of what Hardy presented in today's webinar has dealt with sort of large industrial agricultural landscapes. And I know that not everybody on this joining us today on this webinar is a farmer. You maybe just own a very small parcel of land, but there's a lot you can do as individuals as well. And so, I often talk about managing your own patch, and I use that word because I think it's a good surrogate that can include things like your yard. If you own a woodlot, whatever that patch is, it's yours and you manage it, and we can do a lot. Hardy mentioned Doug Tallamy. That's probably somebody that many of you are familiar with and have heard of that name before. And the infographic that I have here on the slide is from work that he was involved with Dr. Desiree Narango as part of her doctoral research. Desiree, once upon a time, was a master's student here in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and she's continued to work on birds in urban landscapes for a while. And she showed that through her research, 70% biomass is needed in yards to sustain chickadee populations. And so the key to a bird-friendly yard really comes down to how much food it provides. And so we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is a bird-friendly yard? What does that look like? If food is a big part of the answer, are feeders the answer? And so I think many of us, if you're passionate about birds, you probably put bird feeders out, and that is your focus. But as Hardy mentioned earlier, there's a large number of land birds that rely on insects as part of their diet. And so seed really doesn't sustain populations, especially during the breeding season. Most songbirds switch to a diet primarily comprised of arthropods. Even ruby-throated hummingbird, I think, is something that people don't often think about. growing baby birds need more than sugar water. And so the female ruby-throated hummingbirds are actually out fly catching, and they're eating spiders, and they're bringing that food back to their nest. And so this photo here shows not really a great example of what a bird friendly yard is. In reality, it's probably something that looks more like this, where we're really trying to minimize the amount of lawn. For those of you that have small children, lawns are great things. But many of us, especially in our Western culture here, have very large lawns, and we sort of worship lawns. And so really what we need to do is replace that with at least 70% native plant biomass, which seems like an abstract concept. What does that actually look like? Well, a couple years ago, I actually followed up with Desiree, and she had put together some recommendations for a typical yard, so an average size. So if we think about a fairly typical yard being about a 1/4 acre, if we want to reach that benchmark of 70% native plant biomass, that means we need at least 4 large trees of about 20 inches in diameter, at least 7 to 8 medium-sized trees of 10 inches in diameter, or at least 15 to 16 small trees and shrubs about 4 inches in diameter. So it's actually quite a lot of vegetation in a backyard, and probably more than you were thinking. But again, it comes down to food matters. So if you recall from earlier, the results of the study that Hardy mentioned on breeding success. So for chickadees, breeding impacts from decreased arthropod biomass resulted in smaller clutches, more frequent nestling mortality from starvation, fewer fledged offspring, and lower body mass of fledglings. And one thing that I want to go into a little bit of detail in here is are the carryover effects of that. So it's not just a snapshot in time. I know that many of you were probably focused on the lethal doses of pesticides and birds dying directly, but there are a lot of indirect effects that happen, especially when we consider carryover effects. So the particular infographic that I have on the screen here illustrates carryover effects of climate change and how changes in climate alter food availability and habitat quality, ultimately influencing a bird's condition. So poorer quality birds might leave later or take longer to migrate, meaning that they arrive to the breeding grounds later than other individuals and may have to settle for suboptimal territories, which may have fewer resources. In return, they might have smaller clutch sizes, delayed migration, and so on and so forth. So you can see that this can actually snowball over the course of an individual bird's life, where if they don't have resources at any point in time of their annual cycle, that can affect what happens in the next portion of that annual cycle. So we could take the same concept that is illustrating the effects of climate change and apply that to the effects of pesticides on birds as well. There was a really great study a few years ago out of Bridget Stutchberry's lab. Many of you might be familiar with some of the work that she's done with purple martins. And she did a really interesting study where they looked at carryover effects through an experiment on white-crowned sparrows, using a combination of experimental dosing and automated radio telemetry. And so the photograph here, you can see this antenna coming off the back of this white-crowned sparrow. So this bird, all these birds were fitted with Modus nanotags, and they were given a dose of imidacloprid. So a single dose, and they varied that through different dosage and control groups, and monitored these birds and their behavior. And they found that there were significant effects of even a single oral dose of imidacloprid on body condition and food consumption in migrating white-crowned sparrows. So those that were given low treatments for the most part, did not have significant effects when compared to the control. But for birds given a single high dosage of imidacloprid, they had significantly lower body fat and had lower rates of food consumption. And so this is just a single dose. Imagine what this would look like over the course of a breeding season in an area that might have more intensive agricultural production. And so, as you can imagine, this will carry over into how this bird's migrating, when and where they arrive to overwintering habitats. And you can see that this, again, like the climate change issue, can snowball over time. And so let's get back to some suggestions for things you can do. Again, food is a lot of the answer in this, and native fruiting shrubs, trees, and vines are a great way to contribute really great habitat for birds and they're migrating. So we have a few examples here of native plants that not only have great fruits on them, which are available at different times of the year, but they also have a wide range of native insect species. So they're host for a lot of native insects as well. And so these species are great to put in your backyards and in your forests, and can be very helpful. And the Cornell Lab of Ornithology put out this infographic as a response to that 3 billion birds paper that came out in Science a few years ago. And this is a really great set of recommendations. And we're just going to talk about a couple of these today, which is using native plants and avoiding pesticides where possible. But if you've seen other webinars in the series or other talks that Hardy and I have given, we touch on a lot of these others as well. But we'll focus on just these two for today. Hardy mentioned integrated pest management, and I saw at least one of the questions in the comments was sort of getting at this. And I want to make the point, I think we both would like to make the point that, again, it isn't one or the other. So we're not sacrificing food production necessarily for habitat for birds. So a colleague and a good friend of mine, Julie Jedlicka, published this work in 2011 as part of her doctoral research, showing avian conservation practices actually strengthen ecosystem services in California vineyards. And so through her research, they were putting Western bluebird boxes up in vineyards, and they found that when bluebird boxes were added to the vineyard, there was a 50% increase in avian insectivore species richness. So not just bluebirds, but that actually attracted other birds as well. And as a result, they had 2.4 times more live beet armyworms removed. And so that's a group of insects and arthropods that can scare some producers of fruits. And through her work, she also found that there were 3.5 times more larval removal rates in areas with boxes. So bringing the birds in actually helped the production of vineyards, and it's part of this market. And there are lots and lots of really great examples of this. Again, if we sort of look at these California fruit systems, so strawberry farming in California agricultural landscapes show that by just setting aside part of the land for natural areas, it actually was able to increase the amount of their production. So by sort of carving out some space within these farms for natural areas, just letting them go natural, they found an increase in abundance and diversity of insectivorous birds and a decrease in abundance of strawberry eating birds species. And so by actually creating bird habitats, they had fewer of the problematic birds that were found in those systems. So I'll just leave you with a few resources. Again, the American Bird Conservancy has a lot of really great information on their website. You can check out all the information that they provide in their pesticides program. But there are lots of good databases as well that can help you as a landowner, as somebody who just wants to make their yards better for birds, and choosing plants that are native and endemic to your area. So USDA has a really great plants database, which you can get at plants.usda.gov. Probably should be USDA.gov. And National Audubon Society also has a really great database where you can enter your zip code and it will give you a list of plants that are not only native to Eastern North America, but actually native to or endemic to your zip code as well. So you can put all those in your yard and try to strive for that 70% biomass in your yards. Thank you all for joining us today, and thanks so much to Hardy for joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning. I'm so glad we could rope him into this. And I'm sure there's going to be lots and lots of questions. So hopefully we can get through a lot of those.
Thank you all. Thank you both so much. That was fascinating. I was frantically typing and everything throughout the whole thing. So I will try to share some of those links, or maybe Kathy, you can grab some of those links that Matt put up at the end and pop them in the chat box as we go through. Folks, get your questions into the Q&A. We have a couple right now that we can get started on. Debbie is asking, farmers are compensated for growing pollinator plants near their crops, and pesticides are used on the crops. Does the benefits of doing this outweigh the costs?
Yeah, so there's a couple things in there to unpack. So first, I think it's kind of getting at that integrated pest management. And if we set aside some habitats, I think we've demonstrated that there's a lot of research showing that there are benefits to including these natural areas in agricultural systems. On the flip side, though, and Hardy, I might toss this one to you. There are definitely complications when we think about pesticide use in areas that we are making very attractive. There's been a lot of discussion on this around milkweed and monarch butterflies, and we might actually be creating problems by using chemicals in areas where there are a lot of native plants. The same thing happens when we think about creating these wonderful native backyards, and we don't think about, are we letting our cat out, or do we have highly reflective windows right next to our feeders? And so it's not clear cut, can create some problems. Hardy, I don't know if you'd like to expand on that any further.
Gladly, yeah. And I'm speaking for myself and ABC here when I say that it is not without complication, but it's not worth letting the perfect get in the way of the good. This is an interesting program. I have this conversation a lot actually with folks, and right now, actually, as I briefly alluded to earlier, and I apologize, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me. I know there's so much to present. I get really excited about this topic, so I jumped around a bit. But with the Environmental Protection Agency having to look at how currently registered and employed uses of pesticides impact endangered species and other wildlife, a lot of growers and a lot of land managers are coming to them and saying, well, you're saying that chemicals can be bad for the environment, bad for species, but you're incentivizing us to do exactly this, to plant pollinator habitat right there next to the managed forest or right next to the farm field, or you're telling us to put in a retention pond to catch sediment or catch herbicide runoff, but isn't that retention pond also going to attract waterfowl to it, which is the one to do here? And it's ongoing, but to directly answer the question, I do not think that it's bad. I do think it outweighs the risks, if you will, to have that pollinator habitat next to the farm field. There's not published data on this, but what has been looked at is sort of a psychological trade-off almost, where when folks do start to plant pollinator habitat next to agricultural development, the management practices in that adjacent field tend to fall under, basically people just look at it and say, okay, well, there's a bunch of bees and butterflies there. Maybe I should skip this application, or I'm going to stop my herbicide spraying 10 feet closer to the middle of the field, 10 feet further away from that pollinator habitat than I did before. And if you're following the labels that are on the chemicals, you're paying attention to wind speed, you're paying attention to application rates, whatever it might be, those are all really great tried and true ways to reduce risk of drift or accidental exposure to other species. It's not going to be perfect, but I think it's absolutely worth employing those practices and making those high quality habitat areas. And yeah, like Matt said, it's really, really tricky, because I have made my backyard at Westerville, we're planting native. I'm no mowing part of our front yard. We do still have grass in our yard because we have dogs and everything, but We have neighborhood cats, a lot of neighborhood cats that now have chosen my house as the fun hangout spot because there are so many more birds that are there. So it's you know, a constantly evolving thing, but very much worth trying to put those practices into place.
Great, thanks, guys. Jules has she's had more of a statement than a question, but bird friendly is the choice of coffee that I think is actually more bird friendly. And she shared a link from the National Zoo. So I will pop that into the chat for everyone. And then we have a question. How can we really measure bird increase or decline? We have so modified the environment that we don't know what the natural population density is. In Southeast Ohio, a lot of the forest was cleared for farming, so the types of birds changed. However, as forests regrew, those types naturally declined. So which is the right population? Managing for wildlife is a zero-sum game. If we try to increase one, another suffers.
All right, so we're gonna unpack a semester
that, yeah.
of wildlife management into a 2-minute answer here. So I'll try to get through this as succinctly as I can. Then Hardy, feel free to augment or debate me on that. You know, we as humans have been modifying this landscape for far longer than even European colonists were here, and there is some record of how that was managed, at least when Europeans encountered it. And so we have a somewhat good idea of kind of what that landscape in Ohio and Eastern North America looked like probably for a while. Everything changes over time. And we've also been monitoring bird populations regularly through some form or another for 125 years, for if you consider the Christmas bird counts, 65 years for the breeding bird survey, which has been kind of the benchmark that we've used for avian conservation and management. And a lot of the results that came out of that science paper in 2019 were based on breeding bird survey results. And so for the most part, we have a really good idea on what should be here and what isn't here. But that alone doesn't always drive management or conservation decisions. As you've alluded to, we've changed the landscape dramatically, and there are a lot more people now in North America than there were 200 years ago. We have 12 million Ohioans here in this landscape, and we have to consider that through our management of populations. And so there may not have been much grassland, but if we look at all of the grassland that was lost in the Midwest and prairie pothole states, our contribution to that can help the global population of that. And so it's complex. And I don't know how to more easily sum that up. And Hardy, please feel free to chime in there and add any thoughts you have.
Ditto on all that. And the only thing that I'll add is from the federal level, and what I think we're going to start seeing more at state levels as well, in terms of how we're managing for birds and other wildlife for a very, very long time. I mean, literally up until this year, the thought was to get back to historical baselines. The goal was to get back to, you know, what once was, and that's the end goal for migratory bird populations and other things. And more recently, in light of anthropogenic change, in light of climate change and climate impacts, we're now thinking about things more in terms of where is it appropriate to have a species? What level can these species really do well at? And so, you know, it can seem like a zero-sum game and a trade-off, but what we're also finding is that there are some species that are coming in and inhabiting areas and doing really well in areas that aren't as productive. So Matt runs the Lights Out program for Columbus, where we walk around and monitor window collisions. Downtown Columbus is full of peregrine falcons and Cooper's hawks, which is crazy, but it's so cool to see them kind of adapting into that type of ecosystem. And with a lot of privately managed forests, we're seeing warbler species that normally wouldn't coexist when there was a lot more access to forests, that are now able to kind of divvy up almost the different layers of forest land and all do well in the same spaces. So I very much understand where you're coming from, but I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game. And frankly, with the rate of human expansion, it can't be. You know, we've got to see what happens, make the most informed, most scientifically driven decisions that we can. But the constant feedback of data and understanding is so important. And the lands that y'all are involved with are some of the most important habitat to birds in Ohio. So I'm just grateful to, again, have the opportunity to connect with everyone.
Awesome. Okay, another question. Thanks for the great presentation. In your opinion, what is the best way to start removing turf from a residential property to convert to native plant beds? Hard removal of turf is difficult, and I want to specifically avoid using herbicides and plastic sheeting.
Find a neighbor with a little bobcat maybe, and scrape it off. Yeah, in so many cases, a lot of recommendation is an initial application of herbicide. And if you really don't want chemicals in there, I mean, plastic sheeting is a good maybe as part of that, but it may take a cocktail of several different things. And again, if you have a farmer nearby or a neighbor that has a little bobcat or a tractor that you can plow that over, maybe that's a step. But I don't know, have a summer party and give everybody a pair of gloves.
Or start small, you know, like just do a
Yeah.
section of your yard, which might be good in the long term, because that's a
Great.
lot. I mean, if you just all at once get rid of your lawn, that's a lot for you to manage.
Yeah.
If you live in a neighborhood, you might have to worry about homeowners associations and stuff like that. So I don't know, maybe a little patch at a time to
Yeah.
kind of, my
Great.
dad's been doing that over the years. His lawn is
Yeah.
just shrunk over.
Yep.
So yeah.
Cardboard can be an effective one as well, and
Yeah.
it's you know, degrades a lot more easily. And I'll also second the small patch at a time approach for a bunch of reasons. But one of the main ones is I'm actually doing this in my yard right now, and I've got a friend that lives along a wood lot that is in part of their property, and they're starting to do the same thing with some of the grass. And they've just taken up small patches, and I've done that too, to learn about what the soil is like underneath it and what can be tolerated and how rocky it is and how, you know, how much runoff are they experiencing in those areas. And it's been really informative, because my initial approach was going to be to apply some organics and biopesticide herbicide in some area. But once I started to pull everything up and I realized how poor the soil quality was underneath, what I think I'm actually going to have to do is go in and rototill to try to get some of that organic matter shoved down in there. There will be some churn and some nitrogen and carbon release when that happens. But I think that's what we're going to have to do in our yard. So yeah, pull up a couple of test plots, see what's happening under there, and you know, then go bananas. And if you are really wanting to avoid plastic sheeting, I have seen folks use reusable tarps and things like that, or painters drop cloths as another way to start to starve out the grass and kill it all on top. But it's a long project, so thanks for being interested in it. That's awesome.
I would say that Hardy is right. You need to think about, while Matt says scrape off the turf, and what's underneath there may not be
Yeah.
what you want to work with, and you really have to amend the soil. So many of our urban soils, the topsoil isn't there. It was scraped off when they built the house. And so the surprise could be what's underneath the grass that is living on soil that is not suitable to growing what you're talking about growing. So,
And I can
know your
attest to
soils.
that.
Oh,
That was my soil 100%. It was awful. And it took me a little while to realize that. And now if I'm clearing turf, I'm amending the soil. I'm adding to it and building it up and creating some of that organic material, because it's just awful.
Yeah, my soil is mostly rocks and license plates. So yeah, it's, you know.
Yeah. All right. Frank has a comment. He said, I think we constantly underestimate how important a healthy ecosystem is to a healthy forest. 100%, Frank. In my mind, there is a question whether the trees are more important to wildlife or wildlife to the trees. There you go, Kathy.
Yep.
Sorry. You won't win that argument with me.
I know.
know
We
that.
go back and forth all the time. All right. James is asking, I have a small yard and can use can't use, excuse me, can't use large or even small trees, what should I plant?
Yeah, so I think checking those databases, you can actually filter out different size classes of things. And so I would just recommend going there, putting in your particular zip code and filtering down through the different classes of vegetation that you can put in, whether it's something herbaceous, a very small shrub. So I'm not sure what your, hopefully you can at least put in some shrubs that aren't necessarily like small trees. But yeah, you can definitely filter out a lot of those, and there are lots of really great things that are more understory, even understory woody vegetation that can be really great.
I have
Kathy and
a,
Marnie, yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
was just gonna jump in real quick and say, I have a
Okay.
very small yard as well. I've got beautiful birdhouses, I've got mature trees. And every year, the most popular place for birds to nest is in our hanging baskets. So just because you can't plant a large tree doesn't mean you can't make great habitat for birds.
I have
Yeah.
a picture of a bird starting to nest this year on my porch camera. I have to keep going out, and it's like, no, because you blocked the camera. You can't do that. So
Yeah, but
I would agree with that one.
yeah, I mean, my small yard here in Clintonville, I have a lot of plants. There's coneflower and cup plants. But then like I was able to put spice bush in the back, and it's doing really well. And the thrushes love spice bush in the fall. Swings and thrushes especially are often found in there. So,
Yeah, I love shrubs.
Mhm.
I think you can do a lot with shrubs.
Yep.
So I just put a fact sheet in the chat box, all on native shrubs for wildlife. Yeah, and don't forget your herbaceous plants too. They can be really good. We think about them a lot for pollinators, and of course they're good for that, but they can be great for birds too. So we have some seed producing herbaceous plants that can attract a lot of insects as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. They're hosts for insects. And
Right.
so while they're not
Right.
direct food, they're indirect food
I know.
sources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's Mimi. She's asking,
Mhm.
are the microhabitats that are helping birds in general also helping the grassland species that are experiencing the greater declines?
Um, Largely no. So a lot of the grassland birds that we're really concerned about, so grasshopper sparrow, Henslow's sparrow, bobolink dickcissel, Savannah sparrow, a lot of those are area sensitive. And we've actually we've lost so much actual grassland habitat throughout eastern and midwestern US that sometimes agriculture just doesn't cut it. Certainly can get Vesper and Savannah sparrow and some of those depending on the rotation, but a lot of those species, just like a lot of forest species, are actually area sensitive. And so if we don't have enough, now it's not to say that smaller patches, lawns aren't great at other parts of that bird's annual cycle, whether it's during migration or overwintering and other aspects. But in terms of like breeding habitats, so many of them are actually area sensitive. So the more that we can work in agricultural landscapes with farmers to set aside areas, think about rotation, can be really great so that we actually get some grassland there and not just agriculture as a surrogate for grassland.
Matt is asking, I own 27 acres of forest and I'm removing invasives, honeysuckle. Good job, Matt. And fostering native Ohio trees and wildlife. Awesome. Any specific recommendations for managing trees and understory to foster wildlife, including pollinators and birds?
Engage your local offices, whether it's NRCS or someone else, and every property is different. And actually getting some recommendations on your specific site, and actually it can help with if you're able to enroll in some of those financial aids, you can actually get assistance. I've talked about those for years on the bird side of things, but in the last 5 years, I've actually become a landowner as well, and I've experienced it from that end. And I'll say that some of those programs are just wonderful. We wouldn't be able to do what we do at my place if it weren't for some of those cost share programs and some of the help and encouragement. So I would say engage your local NRCS office, private lands biologists. You don't have to go it alone.
Great. All right. John's asking, how do typical suburban lawn treatments help or harm birds and bugs?
Marty, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'd love to. So excellent question. In terms of helping or harming birds, when we say typical suburban lawn treatment, I'm going to assume that means, like a regular cycle of fertilizing, probably putting down some herbicide to get rid of dandelions and trying to maintain a nice thick, healthy green grass. And what I'll say about that is it looks really lush and really productive to us. But as Matt was saying in his portion of the presentation, it doesn't always mean that that's a great buffet for birds. It doesn't always mean that there's a lot going on there. We'll see sometimes robins coming down and, cardinals and things like that, trying to get some of the insects that are there. But when you are talking about typical lawn treatments, the biggest things that can be harmful are runoff. So if it is done, when you water your lawn a lot, or if there's rain that comes shortly afterwards, try to be cognizant of that if you're going to continue doing the more typical lawn treatments. Fertilizer runoff gets into waterways and can promote in local retention ponds and streams and rivers, harmful algal growth or proliferation of plants that can choke out everything else. And then in terms of a lot of the chemicals that get put down to suppress certain species, my next door neighbor, I live next to a cul-de-sac, and my next door neighbor was having their yard treated, and I asked them for the name of the product, and the gentleman didn't know it. He went to the truck, came back to me, and I looked it up, and some of the things that this product was specifically targeting were mallow and different types of fleabane, which are common in the suburban yards. In my garden, in my native plants garden, I have planted mallow and fleabane in order to try to attract some native pollinators. And so they will attract, they'll go to seed, they attract the native bugs that the birds are really geared to look for, because birds have been here for so long. They're looking for specific type of insects on specific types of plants. They're looking for specific types of fruits. And so having these treatments can just suppress some native plant growth. So if you're going to continue doing it because you have kids or you like a nice green lawn, try to minimize your treatments as much as possible. A great thing that I've started to do is just leaving my leaves in the fall on parts of it, or mulching them up with my lawnmower and then leaving them. And that's helped a lot because it attracts native bugs and it'll compost down into the soil. So you need less fertilizer the following year. If you can also pick a corner of your yard or a garden bed to leave a big pile of leaves, or let it grow a little bit more and kind of be like a reservoir or a safe zone somewhere, if you can, that's uphill, so you don't have to worry about herbicide runoff or insecticide runoff, that can be helpful. But getting to your original question, it's really just about suppression of native species and promotion of a species that's probably not supposed to be there. Maybe your lawn is planted with an Ohio native grass, but chances are it's not, just because that's not what's typically in native seed or in yard seed mixes. But sorrel and clover can also be really nice ground cover. They're pretty.
True.
And green.
True. Frank is asking about climate change and how big of a concern it really is. He said it would seem birds came through glaciers melting pretty well. A big problem is we may have blocked the plant migration paths the birds would need.
Yeah, so I know, I believe you recently, maybe last month's presentation with Steve Matthews. And so that would be a good one to check out. And I'll say, in short, yes. So one, the temporal spans that we're talking about there, when we're thinking about glaciers versus like what's happened over the past century, it's so different. And there's been a lot of research, especially in the last 20 years, about the impacts of climate change on bird populations. And so there's becoming this sort of temporal mismatch in as we get earlier phenological events. So if you think about leaf out earlier, that means the insects are going to be there earlier as well. And birds that are coming from Central and South America don't necessarily know what's going on in Ohio with leaf out and insect emergence. And so these evolutionary migratory patterns are based on photoperiod and hormones that change in birds. And as the day gets longer, birds sort of their hormones change and they start to migrate. And so what happens is you run into this scenario where you get this temporal mismatch between food availability and when birds are arriving. And so if they miss the big insect hatch out and they're coming later and there's just not food available, they might not make that migratory journey successfully. Or if they do, they might arrive in poor condition and they can't get a high quality territory. And so that's where you start to see these carryover effects of climate change. And so it's a really complex subject. We could definitely talk about this for a whole other webinar series, if not an entire semester, on the effects on wildlife. But just note that it is substantial. It's something that we're thinking about, and the Forest Service has been doing a lot of research on adaptive silviculture for climate change, actually looking to see how we can facilitate movement of trees and how that might affect wildlife populations as well. So if Steve didn't share it in the last webinar, I would encourage you all, and I can post the link here, to go to the Forest Service's tree and bird climate atlas and look at some of those results, because they're pretty staggering.
Yeah, that webinar is posted on our website.
Yep.
So yes, go and check it out. Matt, you've mentioned several times about additional webinars, so give me ideas. No, I'm just kidding. Marjorie said, what about lasagna layering? I love that. Lasagna layering of dead leaves, newspaper, and manure. I think that was in relation to like another way to kind of suffocate the grass.
I'm more of a marinara ricotta lasagna guy, but this sounds nice too. I think that's a really great idea to start thinking about it. It's you know, I would again check with your extension agent or anybody who might be nearby to figure that out. If your goal is less grass and you're putting manure there, you might wind up with more grass, because grass is pretty darn resilient. But I like where you're coming from with it. If you leave it in the right combinations, that can be really helpful. I've not seen newspaper used for like a large scale grass reduction, but it does work really well as broadleaf weed control in like a smaller garden patch.
I've seen it used as well. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about squirrels and their impacts on bird populations, and maybe some of the other major predators of birds in urban spaces? I know we mentioned cats, but what are some of those other big time predators?
Yeah, so I'll say, at least in Eastern North America, squirrels don't really have population level impacts. There are certainly individual level impacts. Squirrels and chipmunks, even more so, I think, are definitely nest predators. But those don't really sort of rise to the level of population level effects. So we don't see that sort of become problematic. However, if we look at other parts of the world, and we think about invasive species, so squirrels, our North American squirrels, are actually quite problematic in the UK and in parts of Europe, and actually can have population level effects of predation from gray squirrels and our red squirrels as well, that are a real problem in Britain. And so, you know, at least in Eastern North America, our native squirrels don't create population level effects, while they certainly will be nest predators. But if they are an invasive species in other parts of the world, they definitely can be problematic.
I'll say squirrels can be great hawk food, so they impact
Yes.
you know, raptor populations. In terms of some other species, though, as there was a previous comment about, you know, ecosystems being really healthy, and and the importance of forests to that. And forests and trees in general are so important because they can host so many different species, everything from rhizomes and, you know, beneficial fungi, all the way up to the larger species that are actually nesting in them, moving through them, eating them. And even in urban spaces, we see a lot of the same things happening. And it's not always fun to think about, but, you know, the circle of life is a beautiful and complicated thing. So Cooper's hawks and red-shouldered hawks and sharp-shinned hawks can also be native bird predators. They're supposed to be there. Unfortunately, it can be that part of providing good bird habitat is that you also provide a good hawk dinner menu as well. And so that's not a great thing. I will say there are I like working in bird policy because I get some really fun calls, as I'm sure everyone on here does in your chosen fields. We had folks in Kentucky reach out to us because a state senator felt like the hawks were eating too many birds from bird feeders, and so had moved to institute a bill to lower the hawk population in rural Kentucky. And that was something that we had to do some organizing around, and it would have been illegal under federal law anyway, so it wouldn't have mattered. But that was a fun one. So yeah, other birds can be bird predators, and squirrels can be really good bird food.
Awesome. Linda says, for use in my personal backyard, how harmful is preen? Not sure what the active ingredient is. It deters seed germination. So she's wondering how that impacts the bird population.
Go for it,
Yeah,
Hardy.
absolutely. So the active ingredient in preen, I believe, is glufosinate. And glufosinate is a seed germination suppressor and a weed suppressor. It typically won't have a direct impact on birds, but the way that it works, because it's really meant to just sort of help your mulch keep anything from growing up through it, or however it's applied. And it does a good job of not being very water soluble. So it doesn't do a great job of leaving. It is meant to be sort of a long release though. So if you're going to use it in your garden beds, I would just recommend not having a bird feeder, directly above it, so that, a bird might not come down and hang out in it or whatever. But it is a very commonly used product. I actually just came across it because we were putting mulch in some of our garden beds, and I was like, the heck is this? There's an active ingredient label on mulch. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So the other side of preen though, and again, it's that annoying answer of, it sort of depends, is a lot of plants that might grow in our garden beds where you might be using, preen products could be invasive species. And so there could be a net benefit to using them as long as you do it thoughtfully. So yeah, just don't have a bird feeder above it. You're pretty good to go. Try not to soak in water and you're fine.
Great, thank you. Jules says, I'm new to Columbus and am learning about the blueprint. The city is going to put in a sump pump for me and discharge the water into the street. I don't understand why they are doing this versus putting in a rain garden. My understanding is they are doing this as a result of an EPA mandated directive. Do you know the history of this?
I don't know all the history, so I can only answer part of it or superficially. But some of this harkens back to our conversation about like what is under that turf. And I know that Columbus has actually put in pervious surfaces and rain gardens in some of the neighborhoods around Columbus, and that has been partially successful depending on the specific location and what that soil and what is under the surface. It really makes a huge difference. And in some cases, it's just not financially possible to actually put pervious surfaces and rain gardens in some of these locations without astronomical work and cost associated with it. So I just know that has been spotty, but I don't know all the details on the blueprints. Hardy or Marnia, Kathy, I don't know if you have additional details in that, but I think some of it's logistical.
I don't, sorry. Yeah.
I don't have any.
I'd say do both. Yeah, it's part of the
Yeah.
National Pollution Environmental Discharge System, I believe. So Ohio's got a blanket permit to install them. It's basically just it's a human health thing, making sure that there's not gross water hanging out anywhere. So yeah, do both, because then you might not need your sump pump if you have a lovely rain garden.
It's true. Another comment on very good presentation on a lot of complex issues. Agree 100%. And another question from Jules. I bought my first house and the prior owner landscaped with chameleon plant. Any tips for how to get rid of it? I've never experienced anything like it. Oh.
Kathy or Hardy, I see you both laughing. I'll let you chime in.
It's one of those plants for me that when I get the questions, it's like trying to answer the question, how do I get rid of the bamboo my neighbor planted that is now taking over my backyard? It's one of those that is just so aggressive, and the rhizomes are just if there's nothing else there that you're worried about, glyphosate will work, but glyphosate, you need to make certain that you do have a surfactant so that it sticks to the leaves, because they have such a waxy coat that just without it, it'll roll off and you won't kill very much of what you're trying to kill. I mean, you can dig it out. It's just, I remember working with a landowner in bamboo, and she'd spent $5,000 digging the bamboo out of her backyard that had come under the fence from the neighbor. And that didn't stop it, because it was still going to come under the fence from her neighbor, which is the bad part. And so, and a lot of these plants are that way. But yeah, my go-to would be glyphosate probably, but that's if you don't have anything else in there, because glyphosate's not going to be selective. What it hits is what it kills. So if there's other plants in there that you want to save, it's not the option. And it's probably more of a manual removal, which, can be not fun.
Good luck, Jules.
Yeah.
Okay. Frank is saying we have a wooded area we have walked through for years, but rarely see mosquitoes. Does this indicate a healthy bird population?
Suggest it for sure. And it's also how the water is managed at that site as well. So it's a whole bunch of things, but it certainly suggests that there's a decent bird population there. And maybe some bats as well.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, bats can help with the mosquitoes, but not as much as we'd like.
Yeah.
And that's just the biology of mosquitoes, and they're a lot of times lower to the ground, which is not necessarily where a lot of our bats are feeding.
Hummingbirds though, like mosquitoes, and will eat quite a bit.
Great. Well, I think we've gotten through all of our attendees questions. I have one though. No, it should be easy, hopefully. So Matt, you shared quite a bit of research from some of the Western states, well, 2 examples, on how birds can benefit vineyards and other production systems. Do we have research like that here in the Midwest or in the Eastern US that kind of share similar impacts?
Yeah, I'd have to pull some of that up. I think those vineyard systems tend to be some of the classic case studies for a lot of that's where they're at super large scales. And so they sort of provide a great playground for scientists to look into some of those things, because the scale is so much bigger. Everything's bigger in the West. And so the issues tend to be magnified, and a lot of what's done there doesn't necessarily apply here. But, as they're suggesting, just even chipping away at this can make quite a bit of difference. And so I'd have to dig into some research that's been done in the East. There certainly are some really good examples of that, but they not quite as like the sort of classic textbook for some of these large scale systems that are done in the West.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's an important, how they don't necessarily translate, but I like how you said, let's keep chipping away at that.
Yeah.
So awesome.
I'll say the American Southeast especially has a lot of really great research on silvicultural practices and how that can be really good for birds. So everything from, if you're harvesting trees and timber and treating it, and what species, invasive species management, things like that. The Southeast and the Northeast are chock full of really, really great examples of all of that for sure. And they've actually also found that healthier native bird populations in stands of trees that were experiencing Asian citrus psyllid and emerald ash borer infestations saw lower tree loss in those areas. So healthy birds like coming in and eating unhealthy bugs.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in Ohio. Research.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, guys. I'm going to stop recording so Kathy can post that link. But thank you all so much.